All right, so let's get into something that I think can be really scary for a lot of renters out there, and that is eviction notices. So we're going to do a deep dive today on what you need to know to protect yourself, and specifically in Southern California. We've got some great insights from the Martinez Law Center, a firm that's totally dedicated to, fighting for tenants' rights. And they're like laser focused on eviction defense. And that's where we're going to start today.
Well, it's interesting because the legal term for an eviction is actually an unlawful detainer, which sounds really intimidating. But essentially what it is it's just the process that a landlord uses to try to legally remove a tenant from a property. And the key here is legally, because not all evictions are actually lawful.
Okay, wait a minute. So you're saying that just because a landlord slaps an eviction notice on your door, it doesn't necessarily mean they're in the right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Landlords, like anyone else, they make mistakes, or sometimes they even try to cut corners. And so the Martinez Law Center helps tenants in Southern California figure out, is this eviction notice valid and what are my options?
So what's the first thing someone should do if they find themselves staring at one of these unlawful detainer notices? I'm getting stressed just thinking about it.
You and me both. So the most important thing is to act quickly. Time is really of the essence when it comes to responding to an eviction notice in Southern California. You have very strict deadlines, and if you miss those deadlines, it could severely limit your options.
Oh, gosh, I had no idea. It was such a tight turnaround.
Yep.
So calling a lawyer right away is probably the smartest move.
Absolutely. Seeking legal advice immediately is crucial. Places like tenant rights organizations, law firms that specialize in this area, like Martinez Law Center, are going to be your best bet. They can look at that notice, with a fine-tooth comb and make sure that the landlord is, crossing dotting their I's, and really help you come up with a solid plan.
It's like having a guide in a legal jungle, right? Someone who knows all the little paths and can help you avoid all the pitfalls.
Exactly. And that peace of mind, knowing you have someone in your corner who really understands the nuances of tenant law is invaluable. Now, you might be wondering, does the Martinez Law Center just handle eviction cases? And the answer is no. They actually handle a range of tenant-related issues. And one that's really important is premises liability.
Premises liability. I've heard that term thrown around, but I'm not totally clear on what that means. Can you kind of break that down for us?
Sure. So think of it this way. Landlords have a legal responsibility to provide a safe and habitable living environment for their tenants. And so premises liability comes into play when a tenant is injured because the landlord neglected to maintain the property properly. So for instance, if you slip and fall because of a broken step that the landlord knew about but didn't fix, that could be a premises liability case.
So it's not just about getting hurt. It's about the landlord knowing about the problem and kind of failing to take action.
Yeah, that's a key part of it. Landlords have a duty to maintain the property and address safety concerns. If they fail to do that and a tenant is injured as a result, they could be held liable.
Okay, that makes sense. So even if I'm being super careful, if there's a known hazard that the landlord is ignoring, I might still have a case.
Exactly. And the Martinez Law Center can really help you hold the landlord accountable for those types of unsafe conditions. They're really passionate about fighting for tenants' rights in all sorts of situations.
Now, here's another scenario. What if there's a car accident that's somehow connected to a problem on the rental property? Does that fall under their expertise as well?
Yeah, they handle those too. Cases where an auto accident is linked to some sort of issue on the property. It's kind of fascinating, right? How they can connect the dots between these seemingly unrelated events.
It really is. And it makes you realize that there might be legal angles you haven't even considered. Like, wait a minute, my landlord might be responsible for that fender bender I had because the driveway lighting is so bad.
Mm-hmm. It's all about understanding the full scope of tenant rights, which can be surprisingly broad.
Okay, before we move on to some of the other areas that they cover, I'm curious about the Martinez Law Center's reach. Where exactly do they operate? I know they're based in Santa Ana, right?
They are based in Santa Ana, which is in Orange County. But they serve tenants across a pretty wide area of Southern California. So their reach extends to Orange, Riverside, San Diego, and Los Angeles counties. So, their expertise is available to a lot of people.
Wow, that's a pretty impressive territory they cover. So anyone renting in those counties who's, facing an eviction or dealing with premises liability issues or even has an auto accident that's linked to their rental property, they can turn to the Martinez Law Center for help.
Absolutely. They're really a valuable resource for tenants across Southern California. And it's important to note that they exclusively represent tenants, not landlords. So their focus is solely on protecting your rights.
That's huge, isn't it? It means they're totally on your side, fighting for your best interest. All right, we've covered a lot of ground here, but let's shift gears a bit and talk about another area that the Martinez Law Center specializes in, and that is real estate partitions. Now, that sounds pretty complicated. What exactly does that involve?
Yeah, it can be a bit complex, but the Martinez Law Center helps tenants navigate those complexities too. So essentially, a real estate partition is a legal process for dividing ownership of a property. And this often comes up when multiple people own a property together and there's a disagreement about how to divide it, or maybe someone wants to sell their share, but the other owners don't.
So let's say I'm a tenant and I also happen to co-own the property with a few other people, and things get sour. We can't agree on what to do with the place. That's when I would call in the Martinez Law Center.
Exactly. They can step in and help mediate the situation or, if necessary, represent you in court. And their goal is to make sure that your rights as both a tenant and a co-owner are protected.
It's fascinating how many different scenarios they handle, all with this common thread of protecting tenants.
Yeah.
It's like they've got this arsenal of legal tools that are ready to deploy depending on the situation.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. They're really adept at, assessing each case and determining what is the best strategy to help the tenant. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Speaking of strategy, I'm curious about something you mentioned earlier about the whole, times of the essence thing when it comes to eviction notices. Can you elaborate on that a bit more? Just how quickly do tenants need to act?
So in Southern California, you generally have only 3 days to respond to an eviction notice. So that is a very short window. And it's why seeking legal counsel right away is so crucial.
3 days. Wow. That's barely enough time to catch your breath. No wonder people feel panicked when they get those notices.
It's a lot to process. And, the legal jargon can be confusing. So a good tenant rights lawyer can really walk you through everything, explain your options, and help you figure out the best course of action, whether that's negotiating with the landlord, fighting the eviction in court, or exploring, other solutions.
So it's not necessarily about going to war with the landlord. Sometimes it's about finding a compromise that works for everyone.
Absolutely. Litigation is sometimes necessary, but it's not always the first or the best option. A skilled tenant rights attorney can often help you negotiate with your landlord to resolve the issues, come to a mutually agreeable solution, and avoid a lengthy and costly, legal battle.
I'm starting to see how valuable it is to have a legal team on your side, especially one that's so dedicated to tenants' rights. They're not just lawyers, they're like advocates, problem solvers, even like therapists, all rolled into one.
I think that's a very insightful observation. They understand that facing an eviction or other legal challenges related to your home can be incredibly stressful and emotionally draining. And so their approach is very client-centered. They really prioritize listening to their clients, explaining things clearly, and making sure that tenants feel comfortable and informed every step of the way.
So it sounds like they're really going above and beyond, typical legal services to provide a more holistic and supportive experience.
Exactly. They see their clients as individuals, not just case files. And they genuinely care about helping them achieve the best possible outcome. They understand the human side of these situations, and they're there to provide compassionate and understanding support throughout the process.
That's amazing. It's easy to feel powerless when you're up against a landlord or a complex legal system. But knowing that there are people out there who are, in your corner fighting for your rights can be so empowering.
It can be a real game changer. And it's important to remember you're not alone in these struggles. Many tenants face similar issues, and the Martinez Law Center has seen it all. They have the experience and knowledge to guide you through the process, no matter how daunting it might seem.
That experience and knowledge are invaluable. It's like having a seasoned explorer guiding you through a treacherous jungle. They've faced the dangers before, and they can help you avoid the pitfalls. But even with the best guide, it helps to have some basic knowledge yourself. So what are some key things that tenants in Southern California should be aware of? This like must-know rights that can really make a difference.
That's a great question. One of the most important things for tenants to understand is the concept of a habitable dwelling.
Habitable dwelling. We touched on that a little bit earlier, but let's unpack that a bit more. What exactly constitutes a habitable dwelling in the eyes of the law?
Okay, so in California, a habitable dwelling means that a landlord is legally obligated to provide a safe and livable space. So that includes things like, working plumbing, hot and cold, running water, heating electricity, a roof that doesn't leak. They're also responsible for addressing issues like pest infestations and making sure that the property is structurally sound.
So it's not just about having like four walls and a roof. There are these specific standards that landlords have to meet to ensure that the rental unit is actually livable and safe.
Right, and these standards are spelled out in California law, specifically in the California Civil Code. And so landlords can't just ignore these requirements.
So if my landlord is ignoring, my request to fix a leaky faucet or a broken heater or, a persistent rat problem, they could be violating my rights.
Potentially, yes. You have a right to live in a place that meets those basic health and safety standards we talked about. And if the landlord isn't upholding their end of the bargain, you do have legal recourse.
This is fascinating. I always thought it was sort of a landlord's market. The tenants didn't really have much power. But it sounds like California law actually gives tenants quite a bit of protection.
Yeah, California has some of the strongest tenant protection laws in the country. And that's why it's so important for tenants to be aware of their rights and know how to assert them.
So it's not just about reacting when something goes wrong. It's about being proactive, knowing your rights up front, and understanding the legal landscape of renting in California.
Exactly. Knowledge is power. The more you know about your rights, the better equipped you are to navigate any challenges that come your way.
I think a lot of people, myself included, just assume that certain things are just the way it is when it comes to renting. But this deep dive is really opening my eyes to the fact that tenants have a lot more power than they might realize.
That's what we're all about here on the deep dive. Empowering you with knowledge. It's like we're handing you a flashlight to illuminate those hidden pathways and giving you the tools to navigate them with confidence.
All right, so we've learned about unlawful detainers, premises, liability real estate partitions, those super short deadlines for responding to eviction notices, and the importance of having a tenant rights expert in your corner.
And we've also highlighted that California law is surprisingly tenant-friendly, providing a lot of protections that many renters might not even be aware of.
It's a lot to take in, but it's such valuable information, and I'm sure our listeners are feeling more informed and empowered already.
I hope so, because knowing your rights is the first step towards protecting them.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground, but before we wrap things up, I want to bring it back to the Martinez Law Center and their work in Southern California. They sound like an incredible resource for tenants. But I'm curious about their approach. What sets them apart from other law firms?
Well, it sounds like they're really dedicated to fighting for those tenants' rights and kind of leveling the playing field. But what about their style? How do they approach these cases? Is it all about going to court and battling it out, or is there more nuance to their strategy?
That's a great question. What's really impressive about the Martinez Law Center is that they really seem to get the complexities of these situations, and they tailor their approach to each individual case. They're definitely prepared to go to court and fight hard when necessary, but they also recognize that litigation isn't always the best solution, right?
Yeah. So they're not about winning at all costs, right? They're looking for the best outcome for the tenant, even if that means, finding a compromise.
Exactly.
Yeah, they are very skilled negotiators, and they often work to resolve issues, through communication and mediation, trying to find common ground with landlords, and sometimes a simple conversation and a clear explanation of the tenant's rights. That's all it takes to reach a fair resolution.
That makes a lot of sense. Avoiding a court battle can save everyone time, money, stress. But what about those situations where a landlord is being particularly difficult or even downright unreasonable? How does the Martinez Law Center handle those cases?
Well, they're tenacious advocates for their clients, and they aren't afraid to stand up to landlords who are trying to, take advantage of tenants. They have a deep understanding of California's tenant protection laws, and they will use, every legal tool at their disposal to protect their clients' rights.
That's good to hear. It's reassuring to know that there's someone out there who's willing to really fight for tenants, especially when they're facing those David and Goliath situations where the landlord seems to hold all the cards.
Yeah, that's one of the things that makes them so unique is they really do level the playing field and give tenants a voice.
This deep dive has been so eye-opening. I'm learning so much about tenant rights and the resources that are available to protect them. But I'm wondering, are there any common misconceptions about evictions that you've kind of encountered in your work, at the Martinez Law Center?
One of the biggest misconceptions is that once you receive an eviction notice, you have to move out immediately. A lot of people think that that piece of paper is the end of the story, but that's simply not true.
Oh, really? So it's not like an automatic eviction order. There's still a process that needs to be followed.
Absolutely. Like we talked about earlier, there are very specific procedures that landlords have to follow, and they can't just throw you out on the street. You have the right to challenge the eviction, especially if the landlord hasn't followed the proper procedures.
That's good to know. It's easy to feel so powerless when you're facing something as daunting as an eviction. But it sounds like California law actually gives tenants quite a bit of leverage.
It does. Another common misconception is that, tenants don't have any rights. But California law actually provides very strong protections for tenants. And the Martinez Law Center is dedicated to making sure those rights are upheld.
It's like they're giving tenants a crash course in self-defense, arming them with the knowledge and legal strategies they need to protect themselves.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. Knowledge is power. And the more tenants know about their rights, the better equipped they are to navigate these challenges.
This whole conversation has been a real empowerment session. But before we wrap things up, I want to address the elephant in the room. Facing an eviction can be incredibly stressful and emotionally draining. So what advice would you give to tenants who are feeling, overwhelmed and anxious about their situation?
Well, first and foremost, don't panic. It's understandable to feel overwhelmed, but remember you're not alone and there are resources available to help you. So take a deep breath and then reach out to a tenant rights organization or a law firm that specializes in tenant law, like Martinez Law Center.
So it's all about taking action, not letting fear paralyze you.
Exactly. Talking to an expert can really help you understand your rights, explore your options, and develop a plan of action. And simply having someone in your corner who understands what you're going through can make a world of difference.
Yeah, it's like having a Sherpa guiding you through a treacherous mountain pass. They know the terrain, they've seen the dangers, and they can help you navigate the challenges safely.
I love that analogy. And remember, even if you're not facing an eviction right now, knowing your rights as a tenant is always beneficial. It's like having a toolkit full of knowledge and resources that you can access if and when you need them.
This has been an incredible deep dive into the world of tenant rights in Southern California. I feel like we've barely scratched the surface. But it's clear that there's a wealth of information and support available to tenants. Any final thoughts for our listeners before we wrap things up?
Yeah, stay curious. Stay informed, and don't be afraid to advocate for yourself. You have rights, and there are people who are dedicated to helping you protect them.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the complexities of tenant law. Remember, knowledge is power. And in the world of renting, that power can make all the difference.
It sounds like they're really committed to fighting for tenants and making sure that everyone's playing by the rules. But I'm curious about, their style. How do they approach these cases? Is it all about, going to court and, battling it out? Or is there more nuance to their strategy?
Yeah, that's a great question. What's impressive is that the Martinez Law Center really seems to get that, these situations are complicated. And they tailor their approach to each individual case. So, they are definitely prepared to go to court and fight hard if they need to. But they also seem to really get that litigation isn't always the best way to go.
Right. So it's not about winning at all costs. It's about getting the best result for that tenant, even if that means working out a compromise.
Exactly.
Yeah. And they're really good negotiators. They often try to, resolve things just by talking things out and through mediation. They try to find some common ground with the landlord. And sometimes really a simple conversation and a clear explanation of the tenant's rights. That's all it takes to get a fair resolution.
That makes a lot of sense. Avoiding a court battle can save everyone time, money, and a lot of stress. But what about those cases where you've got a landlord who's being really difficult or even just totally unreasonable? How does the Martinez Law Center deal with those kinds of situations?
Well, they're really strong advocates for their clients. They aren't afraid at all to stand up to landlords who are trying to take advantage of tenants. They really know California's tenant protection laws inside and out. And they're going to use every legal tool they've got to protect their clients' rights.
It's so good to know that there's somebody out there who's willing to fight that hard for renters, especially in those situations where it feels like, it's David and Goliath, and the landlord just has all the power.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that makes them so special. They really do level the playing field, and they give tenants a voice.
This deep dive has been so eye-opening for me. I feel like I'm learning so much about tenant rights and all the resources that are out there to protect them. But I'm curious, are there any common misconceptions about evictions that you've come across, in your work?
Oh, yeah, there are a lot.
Yeah.
I think one of the biggest ones is that people think once you get that eviction notice, you have to leave right away. They think, oh, that's it, I have to go. But that's just not true.
Really? So that notice isn't the final word. There's still a process that has to happen.
Yeah, exactly. Like we were talking about earlier, there is a process that landlords have to follow. They can't just kick you out on the street. you have the right to challenge that eviction, especially if the landlord didn't follow the rules.
It's good to know that you have some options. It's easy to feel powerless when you get something like an eviction notice. But it sounds like, California law actually gives tenants some power in these situations.
It does. Another misconception is that tenants don't have any rights at all. But, California law actually has a lot of really strong protections for tenants. And the Martinez Law Center, that's their whole thing, making sure that those rights are protected.
It's like they're giving tenants, that crash course in self-defense. They're giving them the knowledge and the tools they need to stand up for themselves.
Yeah, it's a great way to think about it. Knowledge is power. And the more tenants know about what their rights are, the better they'll be able to deal with these situations.
This whole conversation has been amazing. But before we wrap up, I want to talk about, something that I think a lot of people are thinking about right now. Facing an eviction can be so stressful and scary. So what would you say to tenants who are feeling overwhelmed and anxious about, what they're going through?
Well, first of all, don't panic. It's totally understandable to feel overwhelmed, but it's important to remember you're not alone. There are people out there who can help. Take a deep breath and then call a tenant rights organization or a law firm that works with tenants like the Martinez Law Center.
So it's about taking action, not letting fear stop you from doing something.
Exactly. Talking to an expert can really help you understand your rights and your options. And just having someone there who gets it, that can make all the difference.
It's like having someone there to guide you, Like when you're climbing a mountain, they've been there before and they can help you get through it safely.
That's a great analogy. And, even if you're not facing an eviction right now, just knowing your rights as a tenant is so important. It's like having a toolbox full of knowledge and resources that you can use when you need them.
This has been such a fascinating look into tenant rights in Southern California. And I know we just scratched the surface, but it's so clear that there's a ton of information and support out there. So to wrap things up, I just want to say a huge thank you to the Martinez Law Center for all the work that they do to protect renters. And to our listeners, we hope you feel empowered and informed. Remember, knowledge is power. When you know your rights, you can really make a difference. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of tenant law.
Call now 714-442-9741. Thank you.